I had a small scare right around the time of the book premiere. It was like a lump in my breast. So that was like a little issue during that particular time. So everything was okay. It was benign. There was like no issue. But it's just kind of funny how a few years later, 2008-ish, that I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. So you kind of hit one level of the possibilities of the C word, and then a few years later, you kind of get struck again with another health scare.
Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
And the sad reality is that people are moving from where the water is, like Michigan, to where the water isn't, like Georgia. Then you throw on top of that the problems of climate change, and you've really created a major problem, a disconnect between supply and demand. A single 60-watt incandescent bulb that burns 12 hours a day will, by the end of the year, consume as much as 6,300 gallons of water. One bulb.
University of Arizona Regents professor Robert Glennon has brought national attention to the uses and misuses of water resources. His legal scholarship has influenced policy and helped to frame the public conversation in a very big way.
His new book is called Unquenchable, America's Water Crisis and What to Do About It. Please welcome to the program, Robert Glennon.
And one of the reasons why I'm so proud to be a lawyer is that lawyers are people who tackle problems and try to solve problems. And I feel a duty to try to shape some response to problems that can help make them better.
Welcome. That was an excerpt from the short film In Defense of Water, featuring Robert Glennon, author of Unquenchable, America's Water Crisis and What to Do About It. The book was published in April 2009 by Island Press. His previous books include the highly acclaimed Water Follies, Groundwater Pumping, and The Fate of America's Fresh Waters, published in 2002. Glennon, Regents Professor and Morris K. Udall Professor of Law and Public Policy in the Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona, joins us for a discussion on the latest developments regarding water protection and conservation in the United States and abroad. Welcome, Professor Glennon.
Hi, Gary. Good to be with you.
As you may already know, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the case brought against the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, PG&E, by legal clerk and environmental activist Erin Brockovich, whose story was depicted in an Academy Award-nominated film starring Julia Roberts. According to an online report, the case alleged contamination of drinking water with hexavalent chromium in the Southern California town of Hinckley. At the center of the case was a facility called the Hinckley Compressor Station, which was part of a natural gas pipeline connected to the San Francisco Bay Area and was constructed in 1952. Between 1952 and 1966, PG&E used hexavalent chromium to fight corrosion in the cooling tower. The wastewater dissolved the hexavalent chromium from the cooling towers and was discharged to unlined ponds at the site. Some of the wastewater seeped into the groundwater, affecting a 2-mile by 1-mile area near the plant. The case was settled in 1996 for $333 million, the largest settlement ever paid in a direct action lawsuit in U.S. history. In the wake of this landmark case, would you say the government has done a good, decent, or abominable job of holding companies accountable for protecting the country's water sources?
That's a great question, and the Erin Brockovich case is a really notable example of the unusual case where there was liability. And I say that because contrast the case that she was involved with and that became the movie with Julia Roberts starring Erin Brockovich with another famous film involving a civil action. That was the name of that one. That one, you may remember, Gary, was in Massachusetts, and there was no liability found in that case. And the difference between the two is that Erin Brockovich came up with the smoking gun, that memorandum, the PG&E memorandum that you referenced, showed that the company the utility knew darn well what was going on and was covering it up. And so there was liability. Absent that, it's extremely difficult for plaintiffs to prove that a particular party contaminated groundwater, given how complicated hydrogeology is, and proving that one or another person is the one who actually did it. In a way, that didn't even involve the government. That was just private people going after the utility. But I would say, in answer to your question about government liability, the message is mixed. On the one hand, as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, that's the most important and successful piece of environmental legislation ever enacted. We no longer have rivers, as in Ohio with the Cuyahoga, catching fire, flames actually off the top of rivers. The practice of raw sewage into waterways from cities is nothing like what it once was. The industrial sector is doing a much better job of cleaning up its waste than it ever did. But there have been some pieces, especially in the New York Times, that over the last number of years, either the will or the capacity of EPA to prosecute these sorts of problems seems to be waning. And I'm not close enough, Gary, to say whether that's because hostile members in Congress have starved EPA of adequate funding, whether it was for some other political reason that either the Bush or Obama administrations has been less interested in vigorous enforcement. Yeah, it's a tough call. I don't really have an opinion on that one.
In your book, Unquenchable, America's Water Crisis and What to Do About It, was published back in 2009. Since its publication, have legislators made serious efforts to address the issues presented in the book?
They have. Yeah, the book got a ton of attention, and I was profiled, interestingly enough, linking up to your first question. There's a terrific documentary that your listeners might want to check out. It's called Last Call at the Oasis. It debuted in May of 2012. The director is Jessica Yu, who previously won an Academy Award, and I'm one of the people featured in that, as in Erin Brockovich. And you may know that Brockovich has now turned her attention to some similar problems going on in Midland, Texas.
Yes.
And so we've seen that happening. I've been, on a virtually nonstop speaking tour. I've had the opportunity to work with, both people on the front line and decision makers and legislators and executives. I wouldn't claim that my work was any single cause of any change, but I think around the country, lots of people are concerned about our water supply, and collectively I see quite a bit of movement.
It's interesting that you bring up the fact that people are becoming more concerned about the country's water. Because when I informed people that you were going to be on the show, many of them had no idea this was such a serious issue. They were familiar with the controversy surrounding hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, but they were clueless when it came to other water protection and conservation issues.
Boy, isn't that the truth? Well,
I'm sorry, whom do you fault most for this? The media, apathetic politicians, or corporate lobbyists in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, is that my only choice? Those three? How about all of us? We're spoiled. I mean, if you think about it, Gary, we wake up in the morning and we turn on the tap, and out comes as much fresh water as we want, of high quality, for less than we pay for cell phone service or cable television. We just assume that there should be an endless supply of cheap water at the tap. And if you think about either the history of the world or the world today, where more than 1 billion people lack access to healthy water, that's quite a stunning accomplishment in the United States. So we take it for granted. And beneath the surface, there are problems. Let's just speak for a moment about groundwater, because all around the United States, including in the Northeast, we're pumping up so much groundwater that we're encouraging rivers and springs to be depleted or even just completely dry up. We're seeing salt water along the coast, places like Long Island, close to where you are, having salt water into the freshwater aquifers by pumping so much water out of the aquifers. In Florida, we're seeing sinkholes open up. You may remember earlier this year, some poor guy was asleep and his bedroom collapsed into a sinkhole.
I do.
Yeah, more recently there was an apartment house down there. Across the East Coast, you have places like Georgia, desperate for more water, fighting with its neighbor Florida. North Carolina was the defendant in a suit brought by South Carolina in the U.S. Supreme Court. So water issues are not simply a problem for those of us in the West. And I think what's really getting the most attention from my book is my message that it's not just about the environment, it's about the economy. And while we in the United States may fret about running out of oil, water lubricates the American economy just as oil does.
In May of this year, The Guardian published an article entitled "Global Majority Faces Water Shortages Within 2 Generations." A portion of the article stated, "The world's water systems would soon reach a tipping point that could trigger irreversible change with potentially catastrophic consequences," more than 500 water experts warned as they called on governments to start conserving the vital resource. They said it was wrong to see fresh water as an endlessly renewable resource because in many cases, people are pumping out water from underground sources at such a rate that it will not be restored within several lifetimes. "These are self-inflicted wounds," said Charles Borasmarty, a professor at the Cooperative Remote Sensing Science and Technology Center. "We have discovered tipping points in the system. Already, there are 1 billion people relying on groundwater supplies that are simply not there as renewable water supplies." As a former consultant to the Australian and Saudi Arabian government on water-related issues, what would you say to climate change critics who dismiss these claims as nothing more than fear-mongering?
Well, boy, there's a lot packed into that question, so let me see if I can take it bit by bit. So first on climate change skeptics, the evidence just at some point is so cumulative and so overwhelming that I don't even know what to do with people who doubt that serious things are changing. And when you look at the rise in the temperature of the oceans, the melting of glaciers, the snowpacks on the polar ice fields going down in size, when you look at what climate change scientists have predicted, which is huge and unusual fluctuations, and you see Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, and you see the drought in 2012 slam the Midwest, and you see the 14-year drought in the Colorado River. Oh, that's pretty stunning. As for the international situation, Gary, I completely agree with the quote from The Guardian. Completely agree. And here's one part that's really scary. In the U.S., a lot of the groundwater we're using is for non-food crops like cotton or indirect food crops like alfalfa. But 2 countries that have serious water shortages from excessive groundwater pumping are China and India. And both of those countries are using their water to grow food. Well, with populations the size of China and India, if they don't have enough water to grow food, what are they going to do? And that's where the situation comes in that also involves Saudi Arabia. Because what you're seeing, and I don't think the international community has at all got its hands around this problem, is countries like Saudi Arabia and India making large investments in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where they can obtain land and water to grow crops that will then be exported back to Saudi Arabia or to India. Now, in the U.S., we export a lot of water, of course. Wheat, soybeans, corn from across the Midwest. But we are fortunate in the U.S., despite our problems, to have incredibly abundant resources. But in sub-Saharan Africa, and we in the U.S. have a vibrant democracy, so we can protect ourselves. But in Africa, when you have, in Somalia and places like that, weak, corrupt, or inefficient governments, what you see is the people are basically being sold out. So the problem internationally is that countries like India and China that have huge populations have so overpumped their aquifers that they can no longer produce enough food for themselves. And so across the globe, really, what you're seeing is, instead of an arms race, a farms race. And countries like Saudi Arabia and India are making large investments in places in sub-Saharan Africa to obtain the land for growing crops, and then they use, of course, a lot of water to do so. And then the crops are then exported back to China or Saudi Arabia. And so it leaves the local people between a rock and a hard place when their governments are either too weak or corrupt or inefficient to protect them. Serious moral and ethical issue for the international community.
On Africa, with regard to that country and other poor countries with little access to clean water, is there anything you can think of that may offer a solution to the problem, if only on a short-term basis?
Well, there's no way except to there's no way to answer your question without addressing the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is population growth. We went over 7 billion people on the globe just last year, and the prediction is that we're going to go up kind of relentlessly to 8 and then 9 billion people. How do we find the resources for that many people? Even in the United States, I mean, gosh, Gary, we went over 300 million about 3 years ago, and yet the Census Bureau predicts that by 2060, we're going to hit 420 million Americans. Where on earth are we going to find the water, the food, and other resources to support an additional 120 million fellow U.S. citizens? So I think population issues and population control, better birth control and better access to family planning services is a critical part of what we need to do to face the coming water and food crisis.
Which poses the greatest danger to America's water over the next 5 years? Would you say it's a lack of conservation, climate change, or fracking?
Well, let's take fracking first. Fracking is a good poster child for what seems to be wrong with water use. The truth is we've been fracking in the West for decades in places like Wyoming. What's changed in the idea of fracking, that is opening up space, pore space to extract natural gas, what's really changed is the capacity of natural gas companies to drill horizontally. And what happens in fracking is that they go down, they could go down 5,000 feet or 10,000 feet, way below where domestic or municipal water supplies come from. They go all the way down a mile or two, and then they have the capacity to actually turn the drill 90 degrees and go horizontally across. And that's opening up huge amounts of natural gas. The problem for fracking, each well uses, Gary, maybe 3 to 5 million gallons, which sounds like a lot, but relative to how much we use to grow crops, it's not very much. But a lot of the fracking is going on in places that are already water stressed. So this is a problem because it's adding a new demand on a finite resource. And what I've argued in Unquenchable is what we need to do is to face the reality that all we have is the milkshake full of water. And so if someone wants to put a new straw into that milkshake glass, he needs to persuade someone else to take her straw out of the glass. So what we need to do is to really facilitate the reallocation of water from lower value to higher value uses. In the case of fracking, I would simply require them to purchase and retire existing water rights before the gas companies can put a new straw into the milkshake glass. As for conservation or climate change, conservation, we can do a lot more with conservation, Gary, and that really is the low-hanging fruit. There are places, communities, like where I live in Tucson, that are very aggressive on conservation. There are other places in Southern California where they have lush lawns and verdant landscapes and rose bushes and azaleas, even though they live in a place that gets only 1 inch of rain more per year than we in Tucson do. But they still live as though they were in the tropics. So we can do a lot more on conservation. We can particularly do a lot more on agricultural conservation. But there, moving, for example, from flood irrigation into a center pivot system, which are those big circles you see from 35,000 feet in an airplane. You look down, you see a green circle. It's much more efficient, but man, it's going to cost you several $100,000 to put that in. And many farmers, they don't have that kind of liquidity. So what we need to do is to figure out a way for the non-farming community, and they're really the ones that want some of the farmers' water. Well, then the non-farming community needs to pay the farmers to switch out from one form of irrigation to another form. And then finally, Gary, on climate change, boy, that's rolling the dice. It's so complicated. The scientists say that drier areas are likely to get drier and wetter areas are likely to get wetter. What that means for the American West is a smaller snowpack, which means less runoff in the spring, which means less water in the reservoirs behind the dams. It also means more evaporation loss because the temperatures are warmer and the water, instead of just sitting as a solid mass of snow in the mountains, is now more subject to evaporation loss. It also means that to grow the things we already grow is going to take more water because the temperatures are higher. And there's going to be a substantial impact on how much hydropower we can produce from the turbines on the dams on our big western rivers. Because if there's less water behind the dam, then there's less head or force to generate electricity from the turbines at the dam. And so you have to replace that lost power from someplace else. And power generated by a coal plant or a nuclear plant takes a lot of water to produce the power. So it's got a lot of different moving parts, Gary.
Complete this sentence. If we continue to act as though America has an infinite water supply and ignore the warning signs,
we will have an economic catastrophe and an environmental catastrophe. Right now, there are homegrown American companies like Google and Intel that are, terrific companies with high-paying jobs who are just doing amazing things. And we need to make sure that all of these companies have as much water as they want so that they continue to locate facilities in the United States, not elsewhere. So water really is about the health of the American economy. But it's also about the quality of our lives and our connection to the environment. And already we've diverted so much water from rivers that some of them are on life support systems. The flows are down, the fish die because the temperatures are too warm. We've pumped so much water from aquifers that springs and lakes near the aquifers have dried up. And if we continue to do this, it's like the frog was put into a pot of cold water and someone turns the heat on and the frog doesn't know enough to get out before it's boiled alive. Right. We need to see that some of these problems are out of sight and out of mind. But Gary, we can do this. We can fix this. But it's going to take moral courage and political will to act.
Thank you very much for being here, sir.
Pleasure to be with you, Gary.
Once again, my guest has been Professor Robert Glennon, author of Unquenchable, America's Water Crisis and What to Do About It, and Regents Professor and Morris K. Udall Professor of Law and Public Policy in the Rogers College at the University of Arizona. Additional information on Professor Glennon and his publications can be obtained through the links posted below. As always, feel free to contact me at fromthegman@gmail.com to share comments about this series or to inquire about being a guest on the show. I'm the G-Man, and I thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.